Welcome to episode 8 of Drafts with Jordan and Josh. I am Josh Liskowitz, joined as always by Mr. Jordan Plocker. Jordan, how are you doing today?
I am excellent, Josh. Excited to be here and talking some more draft prospects with you, buddy.
I can't wait, man. Should be a good week. Last week we talked about edge. This week we're going to talk about some interior guys. Also have, as usual, some other things we're going to discuss. Going to talk about 2 more teams out east, how they did in the draft, and as always, we have a nice draft memory and maybe a trip into the draft time machine. Jordan, let's start off, though, by doing a little bit of housekeeping. Let's talk quickly. Can you tell us all about PFF Edge?
Sure, Josh. First I want to just mention that we have a whole brand new website now at PFF.
Oh, yes, we do.
Yeah, if you go to profootballfocus.com, you'll see it's a whole brand new setup. It looks amazing. Really excited about that. But so one of the 2 subscription packages you could find there, as Josh mentioned, is PFF Edge, which PFF Edge will unlock all premium articles across fantasy, DFS, and the NFL draft. You get PFF player grades, snap counts, blocking, and career grades. And then you get all sorts of expert fantasy rankings, draft tools, and projections, in addition to our Draft Pass stuff, which offers in-season analysis, position rankings, and signature stats for the top prospects. And then you get Jeff Ratcliffe's weekly wide receiver and corner matchup charts and all kinds of other fantasy stuff. It's awesome stuff, Josh. And then we also have PFF Elite. Why don't you tell us about Elite?
Yeah, Elite basically has everything else that you don't get with Edge. Start off with first thing, something we don't often mention, but I'll mention it because it popped up on Twitter. One of the things you get access to is the Elite Facebook group. And this week we have Scott Barrett. Tomorrow he's going to be talking some fantasy on there, and anyone who signed up for the Elite Face group, they'll get to ask him questions. So it's a great way for us to be able to interact with the fans, whether it be fantasy, whether it be draft stuff. I'm sure we'll be doing some of that in the future. But you also get access to our fantasy mock draft tool, signature stats 2016, 2017 as we start to unveil them. So all kinds of other good stuff. That's a $200 value. And as always, Jordan, we're having our contest this week. You leave us a note in iTunes, a review, a nice 5-star review, and you could have a chance at winning that $200 subscription.
Yes. And again, then you can dominate your fantasy leagues and know all about the top draft prospects and impress people all year long. So yes, please go to profootballfocus.com/subscriptions and check out those subscriptions. And as Josh mentioned, please go to iTunes and leave us a review with your email or Twitter handle in it. Awesome stuff. Yeah, so Josh, as Josh mentioned, we're going to be focusing on the defensive interior linemen on this episode, the big uglies. So this is an episode for you, the listener. You know, it's a holiday weekend. We know you're all struggling with your body image. Maybe you engaged in a little too much holiday eating. Have no fear, because the guys that we're going to be talking about today are all fatter than we are. So everybody out there is going to feel very good about themselves today, because we're talking about some fat men.
I did not say that to the below 8 people we're about to talk about. That was all Jordan. So don't come after me at the combine. Come after Jordan.
Yeah, I would say I could outrun them, but I can't outrun them.
I bet you cannot.
I bet I cannot. I'm old. B, I'm not that fast. And C, these guys are fast. So, yeah, excited to talk about these guys because, last year, the draft class, we've been doing this for a while now, Josh, analyzing draft classes. And last year was a little thin at the interior defensive line group. This year, we think that there are, it's not only got some better top end talent, but it's also probably got a little bit deeper day 2 talent as well. And we'll start off right at the top with a school a thing or two about, Josh, and that's the University of Michigan. Why don't you tell us about who will be your guy next year, Maurice Hurst?
Yeah, I think it's important for me to start off. Obviously, I'm going to be accused of having a bias here, and that's fair. I'm a Michigan alum. Everyone knows that. I do a lot of Big Ten stuff. But he was the guy that we talked about as a guy that made a smart decision coming back. He actually wasn't a starter either of the past 2 seasons, even though he's very productive. Certainly by our standards, he's extremely productive. His pass rush productivity, that ranked him first among returning defensive tackles. So in general, we thought he was a first-round pick. But Jordan, I was really not prepared. Even though I've seen him play, I hadn't really sat down and just watched him. I wasn't prepared for when we sat down to watch him how good he was. He does everything. He's explosive off the snap. He has a ton of power. He can win inside, outside with a number of moves. He can bull rush. He can play all over that line as he does at Michigan, and I think he'll continue to do this year as well. Really, there's nothing he can't do as an interior guy, and quite frankly, we talked about how maybe it was a good idea because of the depth of last year's class that he decided to stay. He might have made a mistake, Jordan, because when I look at what the interior of this past class was, he would have gone awfully high. And in fact, I think an argument could be made that if San Fran really wanted a strong interior rusher with their first pick, which ended up being number 3 overall after they traded back with Chicago that one spot, I think Maurice Hurst very much would have been in the running and very well could have been that pick.
Well, I think that, you're right in the aspect that he would be a better traditional pass rushing 3 tech than like a Solomon Thomas. I watching Maurice Hurst, and I scouted all the, we just for our listeners know, like as Josh mentioned, we'll kind of cover conferences during the season, and then as we get into our draft stuff, a lot of times, our director of scouting, Steve Palazzolo, will just sort of slice out position groups of different people, and I had to cover a lot of the defensive tackles last year, and so I had recently watched all of last year's and then started watching all of this year's, and Hurst immediately jumped out as, man, this guy would have been at the top of last year's group. I mean, there was no 3 technique like this, in last year's group. I mean, this guy, like you said, it's just a tremendous mix of quickness and power, and can rush from, inside. Like I said, he has, I wrote down the notes. He's got such great lateral quickness. He can basically line up. We saw him line up over the center at the 0 technique and then shoot around and beat a guard outside with ease. So, it was just really interesting to see him basically, sort of get over a man and a half really quick, and make a play. So, he's just really impressive prospect. He's a guy who, as we've mentioned on this show before, due to that depth on the defensive front at Michigan, he hasn't been getting the starter snaps. And so, a lot of people still don't really know about it, but he's going to have, a huge year this year now that he's going to be getting, probably, I don't even know if he's going to get twice as many snaps, but I imagine he's going to be getting a lot more snaps this year. Don't you think, Josh?
Yeah, I'd have to think so. That defensive line is still stacked. It still should be on paper if the top guys stay healthy. With Rashawn Gary in his second year there, Chase Vinovich on the outside as well was very productive. It should still be one of the more productive, dangerous defensive lines in the country. But that being said, I think the depth isn't quite there just because they graduated so many guys last year. So I think he is going to get some more snaps this year. Real quick, just to finish up on him and talk about him long term. In my opinion, as long as health doesn't become an issue, he doesn't get hurt at some point in the year and something lingers, as long as off field doesn't become an issue. We've had no indication of that. I'm just saying that's always a potential derailer. I look at what he did on film this past year, and I got to think he's going to be a top 10 pick next year. And to one other point as well, I think the lack of snaps is actually going to help him in that regard. We're going to talk a little bit about Alabama and a prospect from Alabama and how those guys often come and they're kind of worn down. They've had a lot of snaps throughout their college career. Unless he has just an absurd number of snaps this year, he's not going to have that much because he had less than 400 each of the last 2 seasons, despite him being super productive. That's going to work to his advantage when the NFL comes calling.
Yeah, fresh legs. And I agree with you. I think he's going to be a top pick. Like I said, I mean, as you mentioned, he jumped off the tape in this year's, DI class, and then and then I totally agree with you. And then again, like looking back at last year's class, like I just recently did, he jumps out as the top of both of the classes, in my opinion. So I agree with you. I think he'll be a top guy, barring any other unforeseen circumstances. The next guy that we need to cover, who is also a very good player, but should also be a first-round draft pick, is from my area out here in the Pac-12, and that's Washington's Vita Vea. Just a monster of a man, Josh. I mean, 6'4", 340 pounds. I mean, that's just rare. You know what I mean? Like you don't see that often.
No, and when I watch him, I just can't help but imagine what it would be like to watch film of him with an NFL defensive line coach, how they just have to absolutely be salivating. I have to bring my my rain poncho I used for the last time at Disney a couple weeks ago. I have to use that for that because they'd just be salivating. It doesn't make sense for a man that big to move like he does. Yeah. Now, he's not quite on the same level as Hurst is, but he's listed 60 pounds heavier than Hurst. So again, when you have a guy that can play some 3, can certainly has the strength to play 0, can play all over that interior, can rush the passer as well, 6th in pass rush productivity among the returning defensive interior prospects. So he's really excellent in that regard too, despite being such a big guy that you would normally think of as just a space eater. I love the prospect of what Vita Vea can become if he just learns to kind of put it all together and to, put the hand usage in there with the raw power, strength, and speed.
Yeah, because, I mean, normally when you see, on paper, when you see those numbers, 6'4", 340 pounds, you just think, okay, this guy can't move. He's just a mountain in the middle. But yeah, that's totally not the case with this guy. I mean, yeah, he can anchor in there, and he can hold up and he can toss blockers aside. But again, he can also, he's got some foot quickness and can sort of get around guys too. But the way that he really successfully gets to the quarterback is with his bull rush. He's one of the best bull rushers in this class. He's got a bull rush pressure for every 20.2 rushes, which is the second best in the draft class. So imagine a prospect that's 6'4", 340 pounds, can play the run, and you can't move him. But then, again, you're not losing any value having him on the field on any down because he can still, forklift a guard back into the quarterback on a third down. So he's just a really incredibly large an intriguing prospect because, like I said, you normally just don't see guys that big, and then we don't see guys that big with that sort of foot quickness and still being that well-rounded, still being able to impact the pass game as well as the run game. So, again, I think he has to be somebody who's going to go fairly high in the draft, don't you think, Josh?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. Again, same applies to him as does to Hurst. Has to stay healthy. Can't have any marks off the field. Again, we have no reason to think at this stage that there is either of them, but that needs to continue to be the case. If that happens, I got to imagine he's definitely a top 20 pick. It's just, again, when you talk about Bill Parcells' planet theory, this is the guy you talk about. It just doesn't make any sense for a guy to be that big to move like he does. Jordan, let's move on, but let's stay in your neck of the woods. Look at a guy with a very familiar name that maybe has been a little bit of a disappointment so far, but certainly has an intriguing skill set. Talk to us a little bit about Lowell Lotulelei in Utah.
Yeah, he's a guy, I mean, you remember, like, Josh has known me for a while, so I used to carry around film of Lowell when he was a freshman sacking Marcus Mariota, like, on my phone, because it was just so impressive. He could... The power that he had even as a freshman, and then his foot quickness, it was really impressive to see. Reminded you of his older brother, But again, I sort of expected a different, sort of trajectory for his, production than it's actually gone on, and when we look at, a lot of these top guys, a lot of the times like Lowell's, his numbers aren't necessarily up there with a lot of these guys that we've been talking about, especially with regards to pass rushing. That's something that he's going to have to work on this year for sure, because the run stopping is there, don't you think?
Yeah, let's look at his numbers a little bit. Run stop percentage, he ranks 25th among returning FBS defensive tackles, so that's decent. That's not great. But pass rush productivity, just 5.1, which ranks him 85th among returning defensive tackles. That is not good. And I think it's just an underdeveloped skill set, which is troubling because, as you said, he's had significant reps since he was a freshman. So that's certainly a big concern in my mind. Why isn't he developing a skill set? He's just kind of a guy who's difficult to move at the line of scrimmage, but doesn't really utilize his hands. I think he does flash times where you see he has some movement ability, but he doesn't really ever put it all together. And I don't know if it's an effort, if it's a motor level, if it's just a matter of him still needing to learn. But there's something missing so far with him that he really needs to improve upon this year if he's going to live up to his potential in terms of both a draft prospect and an NFL player.
Yeah, no doubt. Because actually looking at his numbers here against the run, he is exceptional against the run. He has in fact, the highest percentage of positively graded plays against the run in the draft class. So that's really impressive. But again, like you mentioned, he's the number 85. He's the 85th best pass rushing defensive tackle, basically, in the draft class, which is not good. So
and we've seen. And real quick to cut you off because
totally cut me off.
I like doing that.
Oh yeah,
we've seen the last couple of years what happens to defensive linemen that are thought of as just run stoppers.
Oh yeah,
they fall.
Yep,
they don't get taken early.
Nope.
And it doesn't matter how productive you are. And even in that respect, he's not nearly as productive as some of the other guys that we've seen fall to day 2, even day 3 the last couple of seasons because they don't have the pass rush productivity. So he really needs to amp it up on both ends if he's going to be a high pick.
No, I mean, that's a great point because, NFL, DNA, check. NFL size, 6'1", 320, check. NFL run defender, check. So all those he checks. He's going to be playing on Sundays, but what he does this year as a pass rusher, and like you said, what he shows this year as what he can do to impact the pass game will determine if he is a high draft pick or a day 3 draft pick. Yeah, that's going to make a big difference. So he'll be definitely a sort of volatile, interesting prospect to watch this year. Again, could really, really impact his draft stock, could really improve it with a strong pass rushing season. All right, Josh, we've talked enough about the Pac-12 guys. I apologize. I apologize for holding you up. We will go to your beloved Big Ten, and this. I want to talk about. Sorry, just let me go back to the Pac-12 real quick. My Washington State Cougars had an offensive juggernaut that just ran into this Minnesota defense last year and got shut down. It was ridiculous, and this guy played a part in it, and that's Steven Richardson, the defensive tackle from Minnesota. And wow, was this guy fun to watch on tape. I mean, he is just a really unique body style. He's like a little bowling ball, Josh. I mean, he's not even 6 foot, and he's 300 pounds. I mean, he's got great lean. I mean, it was fun watching him play. Don't you think?
Oh, I love watching him play. I got to see quite a bit of him last year, being the Big Ten guy and doing quite a few Minnesota games. He was one of those guys that exploded the first couple games of the season in a non-conference schedule. And it wasn't a bad non-conference schedule either. It's not like he was playing Norfolk State's every single week in the non-conference for Minnesota. But he just exploded with some huge games early. Had a little bit of a lull at the beginning of the Big Ten season, but then went nuts again toward the end of the season. He puts a lot together in terms of power, hand usage, quickness. He can get upfield through contact. And he has a disruption to be able to stay on the field all 3 downs. He's a good run defender. His pass rush productivity That ranks 12th among all returning FBS defensive tackles. And I think as he continues to develop that skill set, he's going to continue to move up there. I think if he puts together another year like he did last year, it's probably going to be even better, and he's going to grade even better than he did. He's going to be another one of those cases of where we see whether the NFL has learned its lesson in terms of drafting the undersized defensive tackles later than they should go.
Right, because his production is outstanding. Like you mentioned, number 12 pass rushing productivity, and then you look at him against the run. He's got the third highest percentage of positive graded plays against the run in the draft class. Yep. So we're talking about a guy who's one of the best in the country against the run, as well as rushing the passer from inside. He, again, the thing that really stood out to me is his lack of size, and how that just plays to his benefit. Because, like I mentioned, he's only, 5'11", he's not quite 6 foot, and, thick lower body. And then, like I said, he just runs with this great lean. He's got such a low pad level. I mean, imagine if you're a 6'4", 6'5" guard, and this guy's running, 3 inches off the ground by you. I mean, it's where do you hit him? You know what I mean? He's got such a small strike area. So
and even on the run game too, when he's taking guys head on, he's just naturally he wins leverage.
Yeah,
just because he's smaller. Yes, I would imagine his arm length isn't going to be great, and there's going to be some concern that he can be controlled because blockers are going to be able to get into him. But at the same time, if he's able to hold his water consistently, because he's always a low man, that's going to serve him well at the next level. I don't see his size, at least the way he played on film this past season, as being a detriment to his game.
No, I agree. I think it's a benefit to his game. And we talk about all the time, some of your and my philosophies that the NFL is a mismatch league, and styles make fights. And this guy's got a very distinctive style, and he's tough for some people to match up against. So, yeah, he does lack prototypical NFL size, but man, he can make some plays. He's a fun player to watch. I'll definitely be keeping an eye on him. Hopefully he won't play any of my Pac-12 teams in important games next year.
Real quick random thought to kind of finish him off. We talk about their positions. If you have a need, it's good to double dip. And you like to combine different styles. Wouldn't it be fun if there's you might be able to pick one off the top of your head that makes a little more sense. But a team that has needed defensive tackle, if they were to go in the first round, take Vita Vea, maybe the second round, take Steven Richardson. Wouldn't that be fun?
That would be so awesome.
Could you imagine that, flipping those two around, having to deal with that as an offensive lineman, going from these 6'4" behemoths just bullying you all day to Steven Richardson, who's is strong in his own right, but is just playing at such a different level for you to try and defend. That'd be so hard.
Yeah, it totally would, because you said it would take those players at least a couple reps to get used to going up against those vastly different body types again.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, and you and I are proponents of double dipping, and yeah, if you double dipped on two guys like that with the different styles, man, yeah, I totally agree. Not only would you remake the interior of your defensive line, but you'd cause a lot of mismatch problems.
And guys athletic enough to handle the stunts as well too. So even within the play, you're having to deal with that mess. That would be a lot of fun to watch. I'd love to see that happen somehow. Let's move on. Stay out east. Let's go even further out east to Mr. Derrick Nnadi from Florida State. What are your thoughts on him, Jordan?
He was another one of these guys that, we've had these different body types. His body type kind of reminded me of Richardson's. He's 6 foot, almost on the nose, 312. So again, not a tall guy, but has that sort of thick lower body, short, can really bull rush effectively. Again, sort of reminded me a lot of Richardson from a physical style and a sort of playing style. He's graded positively as a run defender and as a pass rusher for 3 straight seasons, Josh. That's really impressive.
Mm-hmm. It is, but in the same respect, I think in terms of his pass rushing ability, he ranks 13th among returning FBS defensive tackles, but I don't think he's really developed in that realm yet. I don't think he has a variety of moves, doesn't use his hands extremely well, kind of relies on on his power and just natural athleticism. If he can put all that together this year, he has a chance to go extremely high in this draft. So he's definitely a guy I'm going to be paying attention to all year long.
Yeah, because as you mentioned, I mean, like his pass rushing productivity is, I think, number 13 among defensive tackles, and then again against the run, he's really good against the run too. He's got the 8th highest percentage of positive graded plays against the run in the draft class. So, again, a player who can impact both sides of the ball. Again, I think, like you said, again, consistent, but you said he could be a pretty high draft pick if he has another strong year. All right, and then I want to move on to one of the Alabama guys. I mean, there's always every year we do this, there's going to be an Alabama guy in the front seven that we're talking about. This year we're talking about Da'Shawn Hand, and they had a lot of guys go in the last, draft or two and this guy hasn't, had as much playing time as a lot of these other prospects. So, it's really going to be interesting to watch him this year. What did you see from him on his sort of, I mean, he only played 310 snaps last season, Josh. What did you see about Da'Shawn Hand?
Yeah, the first thing that sticks out to me, both figuratively and literally, as this huge lower body, which tells you a number of things. One, yes, Alabama lines him up at a number of different places. You see him play inside, outside, head up on an interior lineman, on the edge. He can kind of do it all for them. Not a super explosive guy, but when you see that huge lower body, okay, he can pack onto that frame if need be. So he can probably play 5-tech at the next level. That's probably his most natural position. But I think he can play either defensive tackle position as well. And also, if teams are really looking for a guy that, yes, they want to put him inside to rush the passer, but they're looking for that strong side defensive end to anchor against the run, I think Hand is very capable of doing that too. Again, you mentioned just 310 snaps last season, backing up the stud Jonathan Allen. We're going to get to see some more of him this year, so I'm excited to see how he develops. Does he improve his hand usage, get some counter moves going? Is he able to put all that together with some more reps? And I think there's a point to be made with these snaps too, Jordan. I mentioned how it was a benefit to Michigan's Maurice Hurst, the fact that he hasn't had a ton of snaps the last 2 years, and he comes probably to the NFL a bit fresher than some other guys do. Well, that's probably going to be the same case with Da'Shawn Hand, which is particularly notable because Alabama guys have a history of just being completely worn down by the time they get to the NFL, and kind of what you see is what you get with them. And I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case with Hand. I think he has a chance for a big season, but I think he has a chance to really develop and get even better once he gets to the next level.
No, I totally agree. There's on both counts, as far as from a skill development, there's he has this opportunity to do like you said, to show more counter rushes or to do develop his hand usage, to improve on his pass rush ability. And then as you mentioned, I mean he's got like there's not that much of like wear and tear on him compared to a lot of the Alabama guys that have come out in the past. So he is going to have some fresh legs compared to some other people. So that represents a positive for him in the draft process as well. So yeah, he's a guy who could, with a strong year this year, really sort of move himself up the draft boards, and be a pretty strong player because, like you said, mentioned, play inside or outside. You think he's probably a pretty good 5-tech, but he could still pass rush from some different places as soon as he can learn it to do a little bit better. I want to take this down to the next guy. We're actually going to talk about a Big 12 defender. Josh, are we actually going to talk about a Big 12 defender? Who wrote this script? Who wrote this script?
Bryson.
Wow.
What happened?
We've been
Bryson
hacked.
Get on this.
I'm sorry. I apologize, everybody. Somehow a Big 12 defender snuck in here, so we'll just talk about him. So anyways, Daniel Wise from Kansas is another player who you thought, again, reminded you of someone who could probably play that sort of penetrating 5 technique type, right, Josh? I mean,
yeah.
He's 6'2", 290. I mean, what did you see about him that sort of gave you that idea?
I saw a guy that I don't necessarily want just inside in traffic. I don't think he handles doubles very well. Kind of gets exposed a little bit, but you get him out there with a little bit of space. Not that he has the athleticism to be a true edge guy, which is kind of why I like him as a 5. But anytime you can get him out there with a little bit more space to operate, I think he's very effective. I think he defeats one-on-one blocks pretty consistently. And as a pass rusher, he's relentless. He has some decent moves. He's got the bull rush. He's got the quickness with inside swimmer club move as well. And I really like how he closes from the backside, both against the run and as a pass rusher. Whenever he has space, he really does a good job of pursuing from the backside. That seems to be a hallmark of his game. So he's a very different player than what we've talked about with some of the other guys, but I definitely think there's a place for him at the next level. There's no question about that.
Yeah, stylistically, and body type, like you mentioned, he is very, very different. He's only listed at 6'2", but he looks sort of taller and leaner than his size indicates. And one of the concerns about that, though, Josh, I mean, his run defense grades aren't as nearly as good as his pass rush grades, so he's kind of a different type of prospect. His run stop percentage of 6.4 ranks number 83 among returning defensive tackles. His pass rush productivity of 8.0 ranks number 15. So he's definitely got the pass rush part down, but man, we really need to see an improvement in that run defense if we're going to see him make a move up draft boards, don't you think?
Yeah, again, that's one of those things where you have to understand where his strengths and weaknesses are, and you're a team, and you got to put him in a position to succeed. I think just naturally, Kansas State, he's probably playing inside, especially on rundowns, a bit more than he should be. Next level, let's say he goes to a 43 team. I definitely think you want him outside on that power end position on rundowns, and then you can be a little more flexible with him when it's time to rush the passer, whether you want to keep him out there or rush him inside. But definitely, again, if you can get him setting the edge, getting him isolated on blocks instead of putting him in traffic, I think he's going to be much better off. Yeah,
he's another interesting guy from a body type and style play. And again, the next guy that we're going to talk about, same way, Christian Wilkins from Clemson. He's he's played. I mean, I think he played mostly defensive end last year.
Yeah.
But does he not look like a defensive end?
No.
Right? Because
it's a unique situation there because Clemson has I shouldn't say graduated. They've had 3 early entries from their edge positions the last 2 seasons, and so I think that kind of necessitated Wilkins moving out to the edge last season, and really that's just not where he belongs. He's 310 pounds. He's the biggest edge I've ever seen. I mean, he's just a huge, huge dude.
Yeah, it looks kind of funny.
Yeah, it looks very funny. And so while he wasn't as productive last year as I think he's very capable of doing, hopefully we get to see him play more inside. Clemson's hinted that they like his versatility. They're going to play him a little bit all over the place, but I suspect in a perfect world that they're going to want him playing more inside because I think that's naturally where he's going to be a better fit. One of the things he was really good at last season was batting down passes. I imagine part of that is because he's unable to get the edge that he ends up just looking at the passer and trying to get into throwing lanes. He had 9 batted passes last season. That's number 1 in the country. So that's certainly a positive about him. But I think his skill set, again, you get him inside. I think he has enough quickness in there for his size to be able to set up a variety of things and rush from either defensive tackle position effectively.
I totally agree with that. The problem with me with Wilkins, and it'll be a problem for a lot of people trying to evaluate his tape, especially last year's tape, is that he was just totally playing in a position that he's not going to be asked to play, I think, in the NFL level. Again, at 6'3", 310, he's not beating, NFL tackles around the edge, for a sack. He's going to need to move inside. And I'm not saying that he can't, have some snaps, on the outside if you need him to, or, could beat a tackle on a stunt or something. But, I mean, you want this guy playing inside, and the majority of his tape from last year is him playing outside. So hopefully for his evaluation's sake, there's more tape of him playing on the inside this year, and I say that selfishly, and also, for the sake of the kid, because again, that's just going to make it for a better and a cleaner evaluation for NFL teams if they see him doing what they're actually going to ask him to do than if they're, seeing him out there, at defensive end at 310 pounds and then trying to project. So, but he's, again, talented player that we really want to see, him keep progressing this year, but would like to see him do a bit, I guess, more of it from the inside. And I think he can bat down more of those passes too if he's inside, but that's me. I'm not a coach at Clemson, Josh. I just do this little podcast with you, buddy, and we talk the draft. All right, that's going to close us up for the defensive interior guys. We will move on to some offensive. We'll do some offensive guys next week and just continue to take you guys through the top prospects for the 2018 draft. I got to tell you, Josh, our listeners are going to be very, very well prepared for this upcoming football season. We're going over so many of these players, and I know I am already starting to feel well prepared. I know you are already starting to feel well prepared, so I imagine our listeners are going to feel very well prepared. By the time the season starts, they're already going to have, some key stats and some ideas about all these players. So very exciting, and it's been a fun show to do with you. All right, we are going to move on before you start to talk and ruin it. We're going to go inside the New York Giants war room. So again, in these segments, we sort of go into examine what went into or behind the picks of the players, and then also any sort of general team philosophies. And there was some things that sort of stood out about the Giants. Just starting out, Jerry Reese, still a GM there. You got Chris Mara, Senior VP of Player Personnel. He's respected within the league as far as being a good evaluator. But again, you just sort of run into an issue with his family owns the team. So I've heard them say before that if they promoted him to GM, they would basically be giving themselves a GM they could never fire. So that's why he basically can't be GM. So it's sort of an interesting little logjam situation up there. They also have, some really talented other people in personnel there. Kevin Abrams, assistant GM, Mark Ross, VP of Player Evaluation, and then their scouting department, which is just super talented. We'll get to that in a bit. Josh, now they kind of like what you and I thought. There was only about 5 or 6 blue chip players in the draft. Didn't you kind of see it that way? Then you sort of the next tier after that?
Yeah, we've talked at length, probably too much about the depth of the draft. And that was definitely more impressive than what we saw at the very top. There were a couple of, as you said, a couple of blue chip guys, but the 10 to 70 range, there wasn't much separating them. And it seems clear from their comments that they felt similarly about that. Yeah.
And some of the other things that sort of stood out, Jerry Reese said that he spent more time looking at quarterbacks for this draft than usual, which I guess makes sense as they spent a 3rd-round pick on one. Mm-hmm. And then they involve all their coaches in the draft process. So thought that was pretty interesting. Ben McAdoo was in on the pressers, but I think, they involve coordinators and things like that too. They really valued, versatility and things like that, but you could tell that they really valued experience too, a lot of playing experience in their picks. They have a really good scouting department, and they rely on them heavily, Josh. I mean, it's some guys that we've known or that we've respected around the biz, and it makes them sort of operate in a way that a lot of other teams don't.
Yeah, that's one interesting point that obviously they're not necessarily going to talk about it in that respect, but we certainly know, and we'll see pop up for a couple of different ways when we get into what they actually came out of the draft with. But they're known as a team that takes care of their scouts, both in terms not just monetarily, but also giving them a say. You think there's some other teams in the league where it seems like their scouts are pure data collectors. They want to know what the off-field situation is. They want to know what the health is, and just real basic information around that they get from being around the kid on the visits. And they don't actually truly value their scouting opinion, and that's not the case in New York. Their scouts are very heavily involved in that process, and they weigh their opinions very heavily. And I think that has led to their ability to, for the most part, be able to keep scouts around there and not go wandering elsewhere hoping for promotions just because they know they're in a good situation in a good building with a team that in most years is going to have a chance to compete, but in a place where their opinion is going to be valued. And I think that's really important. And I think that shows in the long haul year over year in how they draft and how they develop their rosters.
Yeah, totally. But there is going to be sometimes players who, or not players, but scouts who do choose to leave that organization, even though it is, like I said, a great organization for scouts. But, sometimes, like you said, you do need to leave if you want to, maybe move up a little bit higher. Like I said, because there is sort of a bit of a log jam up there as of right now. And we know that, I think recently, in the past year and a half, I think one of their former area scouts, Steve Malin, left to go be a national scout with New Orleans. And that was sort of a move up for him, and that was basically only sort of possible for him if he left. And as you know, you and I highly respect him. He's highly respected in the league for his evaluating ability. So excited to see that he got that opportunity with the Saints.
Yep. Well, and Steve's a guy that's a name to remember, because I think he's going to be moving up. Certainly, he's probably going to be a director within a year or two, regardless of whether it's in New Orleans or elsewhere. Just to give you an example of what the league thinks about him, without revealing any of the conversation, I wasn't listening into that. But at Senior Bowl, I was on field for one of the practices, and Steve is talking with Ozzie Newsome, a longtime obvious legendary general manager of Baltimore. And Ozzie's just soaking up everything Steve said. No, they're not. This is something that fans don't necessarily understand, that there is a lot of talk back and forth between scouts, between organizations. Obviously, Ozzie's not constructing his board based off what Steve Malin tells him. But at the same respect, it was real interesting to see the dialogue go back and forth between the two and how much respect there is. And how much the league knows about a guy like him. So those are the kind of guys that we're getting out of New York. So with that in mind, Jordan, let's get to the players and who they actually picked. They had a bit of an interesting one in the first round. We talked about how they really valued versatility, and I think that's something they're getting with the first round pick, but I think it was still a little bit of a surprise selection in Evan Ingram. Tell us a little bit about some of the things they said about Ingram.
Yeah, they basically said he was a tight end, a fast receiving tight end, but they sort of really agreed with our pre-draft assessment of him that he was one of the premier mismatch weapons in this draft. I think Christian McCaffrey is number one, but clearly he wasn't around at this point. But yeah, Evan Ingram is one of the premier mismatch weapons in this draft. That's why they got him. They see him as he can play, with his hand down if they wanted to, but they view him, probably more of as an H-back type guy. But he will play as in line as well. But they basically got him because he's really difficult for defenses to match up with. Linebackers and safeties have difficulty with him. They can move him around. You can line him up anywhere. So I think he's going to be a nightmare for the other NFC East defenses to sort of try to match up with. And it was a sort of interesting, pick because he went higher than a lot of people thought. But again, really intriguing mismatch player. And I think they're going to try to, as you always talk about, Josh, they really try to want to find ways. Teams really want to try to find ways to win in their division or to, combat something in their division. So I imagine that, something like that went into this pick. Yeah.
And Jerry Reese made an interesting comment kind of along those lines, and I want to highlight that a little bit. He said, you play two high safeties in this league. If you got a guy that can stretch a defense down the middle, we think that's a tremendous weapon for the offense. And quite frankly, that comment isn't fully true. But it's worth pointing out that you look at the division that the Giants play in Dallas, 24.2% of the time they play two high safeties. Philly, 23.3% last year. Washington was at 17.7%. So while those percentages aren't high, all three of those teams are in the top half of the league in terms of teams that play too high. Cover 3, cover 1, that really rules the NFL right now, more so than the cover 2. But for whatever reason, that division is higher on cover 2 than just about any other division. So to Jerry Reese and to the Giants, it was important for them to find someone that could stretch those linebackers, stretch those seams. And I think Ingram is certainly capable of doing that. I definitely agree with him on that part.
Yeah, the thing that I also thought was interesting when they considered their existing skill players, they thought that, their receivers that they have in place already in the speed and that talent, and then now you add this mismatch player in the inside with those guys on the outside, and now you're really stressing defenses. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think it's a good pick, and, I agree with a lot of the thought processes that went into it. Again, while some people might view it as being, a little reachy, I really don't. Again, he's going to be a valuable player for that offense, and will definitely bring them a different dimension. Moving on to their next player that they took, was again another of these big-bodied defensive tackles, and that was Dalvin Tomlinson from Alabama. What did you think about Dalvin and why they took him, Josh?
Yeah, I really like this pick. I think it's underrated. Look, there's not much that's sexy about Dalvin Tomlinson's game, but they don't necessarily need that. Jerry Reese talked about him being an inside player, a two-gapper who can still push the pocket on passing downs, and I think there's something to be said for that, especially on a team that has two excellent edge rushers like the Giants do. So I think it's fine that they were taking a guy as high as they took Dalvin Tomlinson that can do that. I agree with them that he's not just a run stopper, but that's certainly going to be his forte. I think he can play a little bit of either defensive tackle position. And with his power, I would imagine that they're going to want him to play a little bit of both spots. So I think that this is a really solid pick for them. And while, again, he's not going to be the guy that's going to be getting the lion's share of the play, I think he's going to open things up on the edge for both those guys when he's playing next to him just because of his ability to take on blockers.
Yeah, and that versatility played in a factor as well. As you mentioned, he can play. They said that they think they could play nose and 3 and 5 if needed. And some of the quotes on about it are pretty funny. This was Scout Speak. Mark Ross said he was country strong. I thought that was he's got jolt and he's got walk back power. So I like country strong. I thought that was pretty funny. And then they really like the fact that he can still rush, as you mentioned. They said that he has some transition rush skills, which is nice on first and second down. I don't really see them using him as necessarily a third down, rusher, but it doesn't seem like he's necessarily a liability being on the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, again, he's a guy that if you're going to put him on third down, you just want him bull rushing, just collapse in the pocket, doing his best to do that, to funnel the quarterback back out to those edge guys so those two can go chase him down. And I think that's something he's very capable of. Now, third round was a very interesting pick, a name that was thrown out as a potential late first-round pick, even though we certainly didn't agree with that. And that's Davis Webb, quarterback from Cal. Jerry Reese said he had the best arm in the draft this year, and talk about interesting quotes. Said he's got one of those wintertime arms and he can throw it into the wind, which is obviously critical when you're at a place like New York, because you're going to play in some wintertime weather and you're going to have to be able to move the ball through wind, through adverse playing conditions. So that's an important part of the evaluation process.
Yes.
We talked about quarterbacks obviously throughout the first 6 episodes of this podcast, and some of these guys are going to be more better suited for places out west, maybe like Arizona or some of the schools down south. Yeah, or just in general dome schools. But when you're a team like Cleveland, like New York, like Philadelphia, that has the weather playing a big part of really half your season potentially, you have to have guys that have the big arms, and that's certainly Davis Webb, Jordan.
Yeah, I just, like you said, I thought it was a funny quote. You got to have one of those wintertime arms, because you and I always talk about that, especially when we're talking about people who might play in Cleveland or something. It's like you always got to have the arm to drive it in the wind. So that's always got to be something that you got to think about when you're evaluating these quarterbacks for some of these cold weather climates, as you mentioned. Another thing that they talked about, and I had warned people that he was going to, sort of rise late in the process, because people were really going to love the off the field stuff with this guy, and they did. They kept saying he's the son of a coach. He's all about football all the time, and he totally is. I mean, he was a guy who was known to basically sleep in his offensive coordinator's office all the time. I mean, he's really smart, really loves football, really understands it, went to the Senior Bowl, looked good at the Senior Bowl. But this is a pick, the way they went about this pick, Josh, I would say is uncommon.
Yes, very much so.
You want to expound on that?
Yeah, especially at the position. I just think it's really intriguing that Ben McAdoo, head coach, he didn't meet with Webb. He never met with him. They interviewed him at the Combine, but there was no workout or facility visit. They really drafted him because of what their scouts thought about him. And I think that's so intriguing at that position. Now, third-round pick, if he's not a franchise quarterback, okay, that's not a huge deal. But at the same time, especially when we talk about, again, and the Giants admitted this, the depth of this draft class, you're getting a premium player that's probably at least a second-round grade with a mid-third-round pick like what they took Webb with. So I find it very intriguing that they thought that highly of a quarterback that they didn't need to have the head coach take a look at him, that he was willing to sign off on that. Again, that's just indicative of how much they value their scouts' opinions and how in tuned to what the rest of the program needs that those scouts, in fact, are, Jordan.
Yeah, but man, there's so many teams that would never do this, Josh.
Yep.
That would never, like you mentioned, it's a third-round pick. So you're basically saying low-end starter value. You're expecting something out of this pick from this player next year. And, as you mentioned, they're passing up on another talented player to take this guy at a position who's not going to play, not going to contribute next year. So that's already, something that they got to factor into. But then your head coach, who's an offensive guy, never even met him. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, I can understand if it's a running back or something like that, but you'd think you'd want him to meet the quarterback. I guarantee you, there's teams that would definitely not operate this way. I mean, when we talked about the Rams, we said, any wide receiver the Rams draft, Coach McVay has to see work out personally. And then here we have the Giants possibly drafting Eli Manning's heir apparent, and the head coach has never even met him, which is, it's just blew my mind. And again, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like you said, it just goes to show you how much they value their scouts.
Mm-hmm.
It's just really, really intriguing. And again, just goes to show you what a good scouting department the Giants have, and how much they're trusted. But again, really, really interesting. I also thought it was funny. They called Eli and told Eli they were taking a quarterback, which I thought was interesting. All right, we will now move on to going to just cruise through their later round picks. They took Wayne Gallman, running back. Again, they were in the special teams portion of the draft. That's kind of why they got him. I mean, versatile, 3 years of production, but he'll be playing special teams off the bat, I imagine. Next, they took Avery
and the
Moss.
back they took, real quick on Gallman too. Sorry, Jordan. Back they took last year, obviously, he's going to be seeing a heavy workload. But in terms of the third down, I think that's the guy you want out in passing routes. Wayne Gallman can stay in and protect. That's something that he showed throughout his career at Clemson that he can really excel at. Not a super explosive guy, but he can pass block already. So I think that's why you see them take a guy like that when they have a guy that's already the receiver too. So natural fit with them. Avery Moss, as you're about to go into, defensive end from Youngstown State, but he was actually booted out of Nebraska, so he's Division I caliber guy. Obviously, they felt comfortable with him character-wise as to how he's developed there, and Jerry Reese said he's just scratching the surface of what we think he can be, and I tend to agree, Jordan. I liked him a lot on film. not a top-end explosive guy, but at the same time, I think he has a lot of skills as a pass rusher. I think he's a guy that could potentially contribute pretty quickly in that respect in a rotational manner.
Totally possible. Like you said, they've said that he's a developmental guy basically, but they liked his upside. Last, I should say, they traded up, which was rare. Jerry Reese doesn't usually trade a whole lot. They traded up to get Adam Bisnowaty, the tackle from Pitt. They just said he's a big, tough, rugged player. I mean, they definitely needed a little help on the O-line there. But they definitely didn't reach for any offensive lineman earlier. I mean, that was a pretty good value for getting him at that point. All right, that'll wrap up the New York Giants, and now we will go to the New York Jets. Pretty different situation going on over there from the Giants. GM Mike Maccagnan is basically still in charge of everything's happening there, and then head coach Todd Bowles is in on all their pressers. I'll tell you one thing, there's two things that stand out to me usually about Todd Bowles. One, I think he's a very, very innovative, smart defensive coach, and the other thing is he's got a great poker face, man. I would not want to play poker with that guy. I mean, in these pressers, it's just like you could tell him he won the lottery, and his facial expression doesn't change. So don't play poker with Coach Bowles. He's they've had some pretty interesting drafts, Josh, and I think a lot of people thought that maybe they would take a quarterback this year, but they didn't.
Yeah.
So it's I don't know, it's just sort of interesting building, and interested to see what happens there. So Mike Maccagnan thought this class was deep at running back and tight end and safety, as did we, and also they took at least one of each of those players. So they really started to hit the areas where this draft was deep. And I thought it was a great quote from Maccagnan, I thought, on reaching for need or on drafting for need. And he said, your need doesn't really have any effect on whether that player is going to be successful or not. And I thought that was really, really cool quote because it's totally true. It doesn't matter what your needs are. That's not going to determine whether or not the player that you draft is a good player or not. So, so they said they try to make value-based decisions and not need-based decisions. And they also thought this was a good year for wide receivers in terms of depth and value.
Mm-hmm. I will say this, Jordan, based on that current roster, not that I would ever disagree with the statement that they want to make value-based decision over need-based decisions, but let's be honest, this is one of, if not the worst rosters in the entire league. So need-based, they have needs basically at every single position. So easy to make that comment that they want value over need just because they have so many holes all over that roster that they really just need to acquire talent.
Yeah, they definitely did acquire some talent in the first round.
Yes.
They took Jamal Adams, a safety from LSU. They really did not think he was going to be there at pick 6. Where they took him, they thought that he was likely pushed down due to that Mitch Trubisky trade. They really, talking not even like on the field but off the field, they really valued his off the field leadership. Josh, they thought he was like a really strong leader that they wanted to bring in the building.
Yeah, and that's something that they've struggled with a bit in recent years. Obviously, Geno Smith didn't pan out for them at quarterback. That was certainly a knock on him, and let's face it, he had problems with some of the people in the locker room, whether it's his fault or not. It just never really clicked, never meshed. Sheldon Richardson still on the roster. There's still a lot of smoke as to what's going to happen with him long term there as well, having some issues with him. So interesting to see them make that a priority. Also the fact that they called him an alpha, again, talking about that leadership, that's something that that defense just doesn't really have right now. So I think it was very important for them to address leadership, not to mention just skill set in terms of defensive skill players. And I think they got that with Adams. They talked about in their defense how their safeties are interchangeable. They're not going to list them at strong or free. And that was really one of the things we hammered home constantly about Jamal Adams leading up to the draft process, is that you can play him just about anywhere, including cornerback. So Really, really smart pick there. And that's not the only safety they took, Jordan. They also took Marcus May out of Florida.
They double-dipped.
They did. They double dipped. You know how we like the double dipping. It's not just for Pringles. It's for safeties and cornerbacks, at least in this draft class. Tell us a little bit about what they thought about Marcus May.
Yeah, like I said, we had mentioned before and repeatedly that we thought it was best to double dip in this draft at defensive back because there's so many of them. But double dipping at safety with your first two picks was definitely not something I necessarily anticipated.
Right.
I don't think they did either. I mean, they basically said that when they got to this pick with Marcus May, that he was clearly the best player remaining on their board by a margin. So when you have that gap between players, and you're just like, well, we can't. How do we not take that player? So they basically took him, even though that meant taking back-to-back safeties. So, like you said, Todd Bowles said the safeties are interchangeable. And Todd Bowles also mentioned there's some times where he will use three safeties, which he did some in Arizona. But drafting the second safety basically meant the end for Calvin Pryor there in New York, which he was pretty quickly thereafter. But it's pretty interesting. What did you think about them taking two safeties right after the other?
The interesting thing again with that is safety is not generally considered a premium position in terms of making huge impact. Now, I think Jamal Adams is an exception to that rule because there's so much he can do, and he can affect the defense in so many different ways. Marcus May is not necessarily that guy in my opinion, but it's, again, I think this falls in line with what they said about how they were picking. They valued Marcus May highly, didn't necessarily care what position he played, whether it affected what was on their existing roster or what the true value of that position was. If they thought he was that much better than the next guy on their board, they didn't really care what position he was. They were taking, in their eyes, the best player available.
Yeah, and from a schematic standpoint, like you said, Bowles is going to use safeties more so than a lot of other coaches might. So
that's true.
And as far as they said, these guys are both interchangeable. So it's probably going to end up being a very good thing for the defense. I know the fans probably would have liked maybe a quarterback or something, but two safeties it is. The next pick they moved on. Actually, the next couple of picks they moved on to take some pass catchers. The next one they took was Darius Stewart. He's a guy they really liked his toughness, and they thought he sort of brings a tough attitude to the offensive side of the ball. But they really his workout really impressed them a lot more than the tape. Josh, they didn't really see a whole lot on tape. They said they saw more in person.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. When you think about Alabama, what they did, obviously they installed very heavy zone read because of the quarterback last year. And basically they had a quarterback when he did throw was one read and run. And they have an absolute stud who we're going to talk about when we talk about wide receivers probably in a couple of weeks at wide receiver, who I think he's had over 100 targets each of the last 2 years at Alabama, even though they've been in completely different systems. So that leaves someone with Darius Stewart with not nearly the amount of touches he could have gotten elsewhere. So I think when you look at the film, there just isn't a ton of film on him, but there's a lot to be intrigued about with him. And so getting him where they did, I think that made a lot of sense. Obviously, we've seen their receiving core has been overhauled quite a bit this offseason, so that was a need. And, again, they double-dipped there as well. So not too surprising to see them take a guy like Stewart, who didn't have first, second-round production, but I think could potentially show that down the road a little bit, Jordan.
Yeah, and they, as you mentioned, the double dipped here. In the next pick, they took Chad Hansen, a wide receiver from Cal. He was a guy who started the season out on a tear, tapered off a little bit there, but had a really productive year at Cal. They really, again, like Stewart, they really value his toughness. They really value his toughness and ability to catch the ball in traffic. And that's one of the big reasons they got him. He's shown on film that he has the speed to, take a slant to the house, but They think that he can run vertical, but again, I think he's there to help bring some toughness as well. Moving on to their next pass catcher they drafted Jordan Leggett, the tight end from Clemson, sort of athletic receiving tight end. Josh, what did you watch some of Leggett? What do you think they saw in Leggett?
Yeah, quite honestly, I wasn't a huge fan of this pick. Where they took him's not awful. It's not like they invested a crazy high pick in him, but yes, he has the athleticism and it gives him a big body in the middle. But I just didn't think he was a polished route runner. I didn't think he was super effective when he was challenged with a defender in his face. But they liked him when they went to private workout with Deshaun Watson. And it's something just in general, a pass-catching tight end that they really want to make it a point to incorporate into that offense. And so it sounds like they don't really see him as a blocker, which is good. But they really want to work on the middle of that field with him, and that's what they think they're getting out of him.
Yeah, and then moving on with the rest of their picks, sort of, good use of later round picks as far as having strategies to take them. I mean, the next pick, Dylan Donahue, defensive line player, defensive end, pass rusher, small school guy, sort of a developmental guy, but they really liked his passion, and so taking a guy like that, this isn't a bad pick at a spot like that, don't you think, Josh?
No, I think it's a really strong pick. It talked about how he's a warrior with an old school football mentality. Kind of has the mentality of Kevin Green, who is going to be his outside linebacker coach. So basically, what that's saying, that's coach speak for saying that our outside linebacker coach made that selection, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I thought that was funny the way they phrased that. And he was a guy we were intrigued with off film, as you would expect for a small school guy. He's underdeveloped, but certainly Kevin Green's the right guy to do it. So I'm intrigued to see what he looks like this preseason and how quickly he comes along. A couple other interesting picks. Elijah McGuire, running back. Very interesting guy. They talked about him being a dual returner as well. Could play a lot of special teams with him, and certainly when you're talking day 3 running backs, got to be able to play special teams, got to be able to play third down. I think that's what McGuire can offer immediately. And a guy near and dear to my heart, Jeremy Clark, cornerback from Michigan, had a really strong start to 2017, and then injury, ACL took him out, ended the season early. Real unfortunate situation for him, and that certainly ended up him being, I think this was a 6th-round pick. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jordan. But he's a guy that's legit 6'4". They talked about how well he works in that scheme, how he can be an ideal press corner in Bull's scheme, and I think his film bore that out to what film there was on him. He's still a very good athlete for that size, too. So, again, with that roster, just needing talent, not necessarily being worried about trying to win 13 games in a Super Bowl this season, it makes sense to take a gamble on a guy like Jeremy Clark that, might not be able to produce it all this year, or just might be coming in a little bit raw because of a lack of playing time last year. I think he makes a lot of sense for them at this stage in the draft.
Yeah, and they double dipped on that developmental quarterback. They right after him, they took Derrick Jones.
Once you pop, you can't stop.
Yeah, it's another, same sort of prototype as Clark, another 6-foot-plus guy who can run, who could tackle, who's athletic, but is getting a little bit raw due to whatever reason, if it's, a position switch or injury. But, what's the one thing I always say about Bull's defense, Josh? I always say he wants the 2 press corners, and then that way he can do whatever he wants to do with the other 9 players. Yep. And, so taking these guys, even if one of these guys hits, that's huge for him. But, again, when Todd Bowles actually gets 2 good press corners on the outside, it's good night for opposing offenses. It's his defense goes to a completely different level. It'll be way up there, but they're not at that point yet. But again, if one of these guys can develop, or if both of these guys can develop in that aspect, it'll be a huge in for them. So again, it's these picks, this is a low risk, high reward, high yield on these picks if these things hit. So yeah, I like those picks at the end, Josh. I think those are some pretty good picks there. So that'll wrap us up for the 2017 draft. We're going to end it in New York, but I got a feeling we're gonna stay in New York. We're just kind of go to a different year. Well, what do you got for us, Josh, in the draft memories?
Yes, draft memory. And honestly, I don't remember if 2011 or 2012 was the last draft I attended, but I think it was 2011. And the draft being the last weekend of April always falls around my birthday. And in this case, in 2011, day one of the draft was my 30th birthday. So that was it. The Wednesday, I got in early. We went out on to
dude, happy birthday, man. I'm sorry I missed that one.
Oh, that's
happy
okay.
30th.
That's 30th. Okay. But, the last day being 29, we made sure we went out. We went shark wrangling. We did all those dangerous things that you can do when you're still in those 20s. It's been downhill ever since then, since I've been in my 30s. But the interesting thing was 2011, Cam Newton created a ton of buzz at the Combine. If you remember, he had that wild interview at the Combine, and there's a lot of questions about how he was in terms of his character and all that, and with Tebow the year before. So there was a lot of build up to the last couple of drafts, and it resulted in a lot more media trying to be credentialed for the actual draft in New York. So what happened with the group I was with, we weren't able to get all the day one passes we had in past years. And that, for some reason, left me as the odd man out.
You got booted by Cam's popularity?
I did. I got booted by Cam's popularity. Thanks, Cam. But so I didn't get to watch day one of the draft on my birthday in Radio City Music Hall. I did get to go to day 2, day 3. But I had to go elsewhere. So being that I had a live blog that I was a part of that day, I had to find a place in New York with Wi-Fi. And what better place in New York City to go that has free Wi-Fi than Hooters in Times Square? So I spent my 30th birthday alone at the Hooters in Times Square on a live blog about the NFL draft, which is a very
high moment in life for you.
Not particularly, but a very surreal experience. And I'm not really big on the birthdays, which probably isn't a surprise to anybody that knows how big I am on the draft. Considering it falls during the draft, that's always priority to me over the birthday. So that wasn't ever a big deal to me, but kind of a funny, surreal moment having a landmark birthday being spent alone in a Hooters in Times Square of all places.
Yeah, but at least it made for a good podcast segment. So I appreciate you taking one for the team by sacrificing your 30th birthday.
Yeah. You sacrificed your life for our country, fighting pirates, and I sacrificed a little bit of fun on my 30th birthday by going to Hooters.
Well, you were surrounded by people in stupid uniforms, too.
Yes.
All right.
That is true.
God, I hate those Hooters uniforms.
They're not good.
It's like you're stuck in Florida in the 80s or something. I really don't know why they haven't changed those things.
They have, and they changed the name of the restaurant.
Have
they changed the name of the restaurant. The name of that restaurant is and I just blanked on. I took you there when you were here for the
Tilted Kilt?
Tilted Kilt, yes.
I love Tilted Kilt.
Tilted Kilt is the updated Hooters. There's no question about that.
That's an upgrade then. It's definitely an improvement over Hooters.
Yeah.
We'll have to get this show sponsored by Tilted Kilt. All right. So you know what, Josh, since it's 2011 and you are stuck in Hooters alone on your birthday, and I'm so sad. I'm so sad, Josh, by this. And I happen to own a time machine. So what I'm going to do, Josh, I'm going to travel to 2011. I am going to quickly change draft card, name on a card at Radio City Music Hall, and then I am going to run over to Hooters real quick, okay? So I'll be there in just a second, but I got to go into the draft time machine. Okay, Josh, we are in 2011. I'm in Radio City Music Hall. You were in Hooters eating wonderful food, all by yourself, trying not to cry in your Long Island iced tea while you blog about the Lions. Now, I want to tell you that, I remember the 2011 draft because thought Cam Newton was going number one, and I was about 99% sure that the Denver Broncos, who needed a defensive tackle badly, were going to take the stud defensive tackle from Alabama named Marcell Darreus. Now, I was so convinced, man, so convinced. It was like a no-brainer. And then I get a call from a buddy of mine who worked in an NFL front office, and because he knows I love the draft, and we're just chatting back and forth about players. And I was like, yeah, well, the Broncos are probably going to take Darreus. And he said, no, I heard the Broncos like Miller. And I said, what? Von Miller? And he's like, yeah, I heard the Broncos. I said, what are you talking about? That totally doesn't make sense. That doesn't even fit their scheme. I said, no. And then he told me, he's like, yeah, that's what's happening. So that hit me out of nowhere, Josh. I didn't see it happening at all. So I am going to change this. I'm going to change that pick, Josh. I'm going to change it to Marcell Darreus. So Marcell Darreus is going to the Broncos, Josh, at number 2.
That's not a bad
Miller's
pick.
Going to Buffalo. Now I'm in Hooters with you, and we can enjoy the aftermath. All right, so what happens now to the Broncos with Darreus?
Well, I hate to say it, but there's a Super Bowl win and another Super Bowl appearance. As much as I like Darreus, Miller has just been an absolute game changer. And I think losing that with him, as much as I like Darreus as a player, I think you take that away from them. I don't know that the Bills have the rest of the roster to be able to do that, but at that point, who knows? Fitzpatrick was, at least at that point, better than what Peyton Manning was the year that Denver won their Super Bowl. So who knows what you're getting out of them. But I think Darreus would be a very solid player for the Broncos. There's nothing wrong with that, and it was a big need they had. Let's talk a little bit about the impact of Von Miller in Denver, not just for them, but what it's meant for the league, because I think that's something that's probably a little bit missed in this. I had the same impression that you did, Jordan, that there's no way they were going to take a guy like Miller, who was 240 some odd pounds, clearly couldn't play defensive end in their 43. There's no way they were going to do that. And that was at a time where teams were very stringent on you meeting the height weight requirements of their positions. So most people assumed, well, Von Miller, he's going to have to play in a 34 as an outside linebacker. And certainly we saw when Denver took him, started him out on run plays, they tried to play him an outside linebacker, start him out there, and then put him on the edge to rush the passer while they developed his skill set. So there was a little bit of that there. But really, Von Miller was the first one where they said, you know what? We can be a little bit smaller on the edge. That's not as important. What's important is his game-breaking ability in terms of ability to rush the passer. That takes precedent over what we think he can do in terms of a run stopper, just because he's not prototypical size-wise. And we've seen a number of guys come out and do just that. I mean, obviously Atlanta probably should have won this past Super Bowl. Their first pick, Vic Beasley, from the year prior, same deal with him. Low 240s, premier pass rush specialist, led the league in sacks last year, but not a guy that you would really feel confident standing up and holding his own on the edge as a 43 defensive end, even though that's where you kind of perceived he was going to end up having to play in Atlanta. Really, Von Miller was the first of those guys.
Yeah, I mean, he's going to make a huge impact in Buffalo. I mean, obviously, he would make a huge impact anywhere. So, yeah, that Bills defense is going to have the premier pass rusher to use for from here on out. The biggest thing, though, to me is that Super Bowl 50. I mean, the Panthers are now Super Bowl 50 champs because the Super Bowl 50 MVP for the Broncos is now on the Bills. Yeah, so I mean, as you touched on, I mean, I think that Super Bowl victory is just gone.
Well, or it could be New England Patriots are now, after this year, back-to-back champs again.
Oh, maybe.
Or back-to-back.
I'm just going to go with it's Carolina. I'm going to go with it's Carolina.
Straight. Okay.
And they're champions. Quit it, Josh. Quit trying to take the Super Bowl away from the Panthers. They rightfully won it in this time machine.
Fine, you win this round.
All right. So on that note, the Panthers are Super Bowl 50 champions. We will be back next week to talk about offensive linemen. We've been spending the last 2 shows talking about guys who could get after the quarterback. So next week we'll talk about guys who protect the quarterback. Again, please leave us a 5-star review with your Twitter handle or email address in it, and you'll be eligible to win a PFF Elite subscription. We will see you guys next week. Bye.